Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into some sources you shared that really make you think. We're challenging our assumptions about allyship, about kindness, and looking at the gap between, saying the right things and actually doing them.
Exactly. Our goal here is to unpack this idea of conditional compassion
Mhm.
that the sources really hammer home. It's a critique not just of individuals, but of how sometimes institutions kind of allow us to offer support only when it's convenient or maybe when it benefits us.
Yeah, the source material pulls no punches right from the start. It talks about a universal hypocrisy where people use faith or power or privilege to justify shutting people out or staying silent or even spreading hate. It's quite confronting.
It really is. It forces you to stop and think. The question that just hangs there throughout the analysis is like, well, it's simple but devastating. Where were you when others suffered? It's asking for an audit of your actions, not just your intentions.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The critique really starts with something I think everyone recognizes, even if they haven't put a name to it. They call it the problem of the doorstep and the shoes.
It's about that delayed reaction, isn't it? The sources point out this pattern where people, or maybe whole groups, only find their voice, find their moral outrage, when the injustice literally lands on their own doorstep.
Right. And when it does hit them, suddenly the language changes completely. They start to feel the heat, maybe professionally or socially, and the first thing they say is often, you don't know what it's like. If only you could walk in my shoes.
And that plea for empathy, which is sincere in that moment, it often clashes with the experience of people who've been suffering all along. The sources label this perspective siloed thinking.
Siloed thinking.
Yeah, that kind of harmful, maybe ego-driven belief that your pain is totally unique, unprecedented, and the only thing that deserves immediate global attention right now.
That term, siloed thinking, feels spot on. It implies this deliberate walling off. It's not just being unaware. It's like choosing to ignore suffering elsewhere until you absolutely can't anymore.
Precisely. And the argument is that this isn't real solidarity. It looks more like opportunism. If you've ignored systemic issues affecting others for years and then suddenly demand everyone rally when your interests are threatened, well, your moral standing is shaky. The sources are blunt. You can't really amplify your wounds effectively if you spent years ignoring mine.
Okay, but let me push on that a bit, because the sources are asking for a lot, aren't they?
Yeah.
Is there room for, say, fear? People might stay silent because they're genuinely afraid of losing their job, their standing in the community. Does the critique account for that?
It does acknowledge fear, but it reframes it. The sources suggest fear often becomes the justification for the conditionality. Like, if justice was truly the driving force, your actions wouldn't stop where your personal risk begins. They argue real allies share the risk. People operating with conditional compassion are often just waiting for the risk to pass, which usually only happens when the problem affects them directly. And that inaction actually makes the original harm worse, making their later calls for empathy feel, well, a bit hollow.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So if the problem is only acting when it hits home, what's the mechanism that lets people stay quiet for so long, even while, maybe talking a good game about values? This is where the mask of tolerance comes in.
Right. This is where they bring in a more academic lens. The sources mention something called the 6 stages framework. It basically maps out how indifference can progress, especially in privileged settings or individuals, and the mask of tolerance is sort of the endpoint of that progression.
Oh, interesting. Can you say more about those stages? Do they detail how you get from stage 1 to wearing this mask?
It's less about fixed steps and more about the internal justifications. It might start with simple denial, stage 1, like acknowledging something bad is happening over there, but refusing to really engage. Then it might move to selective engagement, doing only the safe, easy things. The really critical later stages involve actually taking over the language of justice itself.
And that's the mask of tolerance, the performance. Acting like an ally publicly, maybe posting online, championing diversity, while behind the scenes you're acting as a gatekeeper of the very systems you claim to oppose, or just quietly upholding inequity.
Exactly. The language in the sources gets pretty sharp here. Wolves in sheep's clothing, performers of compassion. And they argue this performance can actually be more damaging than outright opposition.
More damaging. Why? Isn't using the right language at least a tiny step forward?
The sources argue it often isn't. The mask of tolerance can suck the energy out of real change because the people wearing it often control resources or visibility. They use the language of reform, but make sure the actual system stays the same.
So they become the roadblock.
In a way, yes. Precisely because they look like allies, it becomes really hard to call out the inaction or the subtle gatekeeping. They're using their privilege to manage the situation, not to dismantle the problem.
And this connects directly to how privilege and even faith get misused, right? It's not just corporate speak. It gets into our communities, our spiritual lives.
Absolutely. The sources spend quite a bit of time on how religion, power, privilege can be turned into weapons to divide people, control them, or just justify staying silent instead of being tools for justice for everyone.
It's that hypocrisy of twisting sacred texts, isn't it? Whether it's the Bible, the Quran, the Siddur, taking texts meant to inspire compassion and using them to justify hating or excluding certain groups.
That's exactly the mechanism they point to. Picking out verses about purity or tradition, maybe, while ignoring the big overarching commands about loving your neighbor, caring for the stranger, pursuing justice.
And this conditionality means discrimination doesn't just happen out in the open. The sources say it happens in offices, boardrooms, schools, right after people might have been sitting in prayer. It shows their kindness has conditions, their love has borders. Compassion only extends to people like them.
Yeah, and they list specific examples of things ignored by these performers.
Right.
Where were you when racism was tearing through someone else's life? When women were sidelined? When kids were silenced? When another religious group was attacked? The silence, they argue, is never neutral. It's an active choice that props up the unfair system.
And that choice, that refusal to see the shared humanity, it eventually comes back around, which leads us straight into this concept of the boomerang effect of silence.
This is where the script really flips. Because eventually, the sources say, the person who stayed quiet, feeling safe in their cave of privilege, finds themselves in trouble. And then they ask that bewildered question, why isn't anyone speaking up for me?
Right. The painful irony.
And the source material offers a really harsh answer. It basically says, maybe you taught them how to be silent.
Wow. That's a heavy indictment. It puts the responsibility squarely back on the person who chose inaction.
It shows how injustice can be cyclical. If you stand by while different groups are targeted one by one, the whole ecosystem of support just breaks down. By the time the problem reaches the person who stayed silent, maybe potential allies have already been weakened, silenced, or just overwhelmed.
Or maybe, and this feels even harsher, the people you ignored earlier have just run out of empathy for you. You can't really demand something you weren't willing to give, especially if you only offered it conditionally before.
Exactly. You can't hide in your cave of privilege, as the sources put it, and then expect people to rush in and save you from a fire you ignored when it was burning down their homes. That cave doesn't just block out the noise, it makes you think you're fundamentally safer than others, and that's a huge blind spot.
Which makes the call to action feel absolutely essential. If the critique is about conditional compassion, then the solution has to be unconditional action. The sources make a strong pivot here. They clarify the issue isn't faith itself, but the hypocrisy of using it to divide rather than unite.
Yes, the focus shifts completely from talk to action. The sources argue that the real measure of your devotion, whether that's spiritual devotion or just commitment to ethical principles, isn't what you worship or claim to believe, it's who you protect.
So it's about taking off that mask of tolerance actively. It requires more than just statements. It demands real change within institutions and from individuals.
Definitely. The sources call for specific, tangible actions way beyond just thoughts and prayers. A key one is protecting your neighbor, which means getting involved in your community, advocating for vulnerable people, even when their skin is darker, their accent different, their beliefs unfamiliar.
And they also point inward, towards organizational integrity. Things like protecting children in churches, mosques, community centers, which means not just safety from outside, but holding leaders accountable internally.
And, critically, they demand action on equity for women, not just talking about it, but real changes in structure. That means fair representation in leadership, fair pay, clear pathways to opportunity, not just a diversity statement that gets dusted off once a year. You have to stand up for people right where you are, even if it challenges a system that's benefited you.
So the ultimate goal is pretty profound. Drop the conditional kindness, take off the masks, and actually be an agent for justice, even when it's difficult or costs something. It's realizing that being good isn't about claiming it, it's about seeing suffering and refusing to walk by no matter what.
It's understanding that justice should be universal. If you let that principle be broken for others, you can't be surprised when it gets broken for you. Our fates are tied together. That's the core reminder.
Well, this has been a challenging deep dive, but definitely a necessary one. We started with that critical question, where were you? The challenge now, for all of us listening, is to move past that siloed thinking, to recognize That if we want empathy, we need to have offered it first,
Hmm.
unconditionally.
And maybe to leave you with that final framework, the source material offers for reflection. It boils true spirituality, or maybe just true ethical living, down to three non-negotiables. The challenge is to measure ourselves against them regularly.
Love, without exception.
Compassion without condition.
Justice, without delay.
And as you think about the sources in your own life, maybe ask yourself, which of those three is the hardest for you right now to uphold all the time? Because that point of friction, that difficulty, that's probably where the most important work needs to be done.